the U.S. Gerald R. Ford. The most expensive, most technologically advanced warship ever constructed by human hands, a floating monument to American imperial ambition worth $13 billion, is limping into the Greek port of Soda Bay for repairs. Not because Iran fired a missile at it, because a fire broke out in the laundry room. Let that sink in. The mightiest naval force in the history of civilization, grounded by laundry fire, and while that carrier burns in Crete, Russia has just stepped into the most volatile geopolitical theater since the Second World War, not with tanks, not with nuclear warheads, but with something far more consequential: warships in the Strait of Hormuz operating alongside Iran as American fighter jets roar overhead. The architecture of the post-Cold War world order is cracking, and Washington, distracted by its own grandiosity, didn't see it coming. Welcome. Let's talk about what is actually happening and why the mainstream narrative being fed to you is dangerously, catastrophically wrong. Let us begin with the facts as they stand today. The first days of April 2026. On the 28th of February, the United States and Israel launched what Washington branded Operation Epic Fury, a massive coordinated strike campaign against Iran. The supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was assassinated. The nuclear facilities were bombed. Command structures were shattered. Tehran responded by doing the one thing it had always threatened, but which every analyst in Washington believed was a bluff. It closed the Strait of Hormuz. Tie everyone. 20 million barrels of oil per day, roughly 1/5 of all globally traded petroleum, simply stopped moving. Brent crude surged past $100 a barrel within days and hit a peak of $126. The largest disruption to global energy supply since the 1973 oil shock. The largest in the entire history of the modern oil market. And yet, the Trump administration, drunk on its own military swagger, giddy with the kind of reckless confidence that only comes from having confused power with wisdom, had apparently not accounted for this possibility in any serious strategic plan. Now, here is where I want you to pay very careful attention, because this is the part the pundits on cable television will not tell you. Russia did not merely stand on the sidelines watching. In February, just days before the American and Israeli strikes on Iran began, Russia, China, and Iran conducted their Maritime Security Belt 2026 naval exercises, the 8th such exercise since 2019, directly in the Strait of Hormuz. Russian warships, including the corvette Stoiky, docked at Bandar Abbas, the heart of Iran's naval operations on the strait. Russian Admiral Alexei Sajeev didn't mince words. He said Russia was ready to conduct joint operations in any region. He said the two navies could manage and resolve many maritime and coastal issues together. That was a message. A clear, deliberate message addressed not to the Iranian people, but to the Pentagon. And then, weeks before all of this, in January of this year, the U.S. Navy SEALs, delivered by the elite Night Stalkers of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, had already boarded and seized a Russian flagged oil tanker in the North Atlantic. The Bella One, a rusting vessel accused of sanctions evasion, re-registered just days earlier under the Russian flag, part of what Washington calls the Shadow Fleet. Russia's foreign ministry called it a violation of international maritime law. A Russian parliamentarian called it piracy and demanded Moscow arm its commercial vessels and sink American ships in retaliation. The Russian military had reportedly dispatched submarine and surface vessels to the vicinity when the boarding occurred. Think about what you are witnessing. The United States is simultaneously waging open war against Iran, seizing Russian flagged vessels on the high seas and demanding that the whole world line up behind its military agenda in the Gulf. And the response from its NATO allies, Germany, Spain, Italy, the United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, one after another, they refused. Germany's defense minister, Boris Pistorius, said simply, "This is not our war. We have not started it." Trump called them cowards. He called NATO a paper tiger. He is not entirely wrong. But his solution, doubling down, escalating, threatening to obliterate Iranian power plants, is the solution of a man who believes history bends to brute force. It does not. History is not a nail. American military power is not a hammer, and the Strait of Hormuz is not a problem that can be solved by sending A-10 Thunderbolts to strafe speedboats. Let me explain why this matters at a structural level. Because the economics of what is happening should terrify every household on the planet. The Strait of Hormuz is not merely a shipping lane, it is the jugular vein of the global capitalist economy. Up to 30% of internationally traded fertilizers move through it. Natural gas, aluminum, helium. The supply chains of modern industrial civilization run through that 21-mile wide passage between Iran and Oman. Thank goodness, when it closes, even for weeks, the reverberations are not linear, they are exponential. Fertilizer prices up 20% going into spring planting season. Energy costs spiking across Europe and Asia. Insurance markets seizing, shipping companies paralyzed. We are not watching a regional conflict. We are watching a stress test of the entire post-1945 global economic architecture, and it is failing. Now, back to Russia. Because Russia's role in all of this is not peripheral. It is central, and it is being systematically underplayed in Western media. Moscow has made a set of calculated moves that reveal a coherent strategic logic. First, the shadow fleet. Russia has constructed an elaborate parallel oil trading infrastructure, hundreds of tankers operating outside Western sanctions regimes, supplying Moscow's petroleum revenues that keep the Ukrainian war machine funded. When the United States seized the Bella One, it was not merely enforcing sanctions. It was declaring maritime war on Russia's economic lifeline. Moscow understood this. The Kremlin stayed publicly silent, characteristically, but the machinery of response was already turning. Second, Iran. Russia has been supplying Iran with upgraded Shade drones, the same drone design the Tehran originally provided to Moscow for use against Ukraine. The relationship between Moscow and Tehran is not transactional anymore. It is structural. It is symbiotic. Russia gets Iranian weapons technology and a geopolitical ally that ties down American military resources in the Middle East. Iran gets Russian missile technology, diplomatic cover at the UN Security Council, and now, crucially, naval solidarity in its most exposed moment. Third, the George H.W. Bush, with the Gerald R. Ford sidelined by fire and 9 months of overextended deployment, Washington is rushing the USS George H.W. Bush carrier strike group to fill the gap. But the transit from the American East Coast to the Eastern Mediterranean takes 10 to 12 days minimum. There is a window, a gap in American carrier aviation coverage over the most contested maritime theater on Earth. Russia, China, and Iran understand this. They are not going to waste it. And here is the strategic irony that should keep every serious analyst awake at night. The United States has spent the last several years justifying its breakneck military spending, trillions of dollars, year after year, on the premise that it is deterring adversaries, that the sheer scale of American power prevents wars from starting. But what Operation Epic Fury has demonstrated with brutal clarity is that American military power can start wars far more easily than it can end them. It can assassinate supreme leaders. It can sink Iranian frigates. It can conduct 7,000 strike missions. And yet it cannot open a 21-mile strait. It cannot stop oil prices from doubling. It cannot prevent Russia from parking warships at Bandar Abbas and whispering to the world, "We are here." This is not a failure of tactics. It is a failure of strategy. It is the predictable consequence of a foreign policy built not on the careful architecture of mutual interests, but on the blunt application of force, and the assumption that everyone else will simply adjust. I want to say something about the human dimension of this, because in our obsession with carrier strike groups and sanctions evasion networks, we forget that real people are paying the price. 3 American service members have already been killed in Iranian strikes on U.S. installations. 29 were injured when Iranian missiles and drones hit Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia. The crew of the USS Gerald R. Ford, sailors who have been at sea for 9 months, many of whom lost their beds in the laundry fire, who watched their ship limp away from combat. These are human beings, not abstractions. On the Iranian side, thousands of IRGC personnel killed or wounded in the opening strikes. A civilian woman killed in Tel Aviv residents of Beit Shemesh buried, workers in Bahrain killed when an Iranian drone struck a port. And across the global south, in Vietnam, in Indonesia, in Colombia, in Nigeria, households are paying more for food because fertilizer prices have spiked, because the spring planting season is being disrupted, because two nuclear armed states and their proxies decided to settle scores in a 21-mile waterway that the rest of humanity depends upon for its daily sustenance. This is what empire costs, not just in the obvious currencies of blood and treasury, but in the invisible tax it levies on the billions of people who have no vote, no voice, no seat at the table, and yet bear the consequences of every miscalculation made by the powerful. What happens next? Let me be honest with you. The situation is genuinely unpredictable in its specifics, but structurally the trajectory is clear. The United States will attempt to reopen the Strait of Hormuz by military force. This is no longer a question of whether, but how and at what cost. Trump has already threatened to obliterate Iranian power plants. Xinjiang is using GBU 725 1,000-pound bunker busters on underground missile silos along the Iranian coast. A-10 attack aircraft and Apache gun ships are being deployed against Iranian fast attack vessels. The military logic is escalatory by design. Russia will continue to provide Iran with diplomatic cover and material support, upgraded Shaheeds, intelligence sharing, naval presence, while maintaining enough ambiguity to avoid a direct confrontation with American forces. This is Putin's playbook: maximum leverage at minimum direct risk. He understands, perhaps more clearly than anyone in Washington, that the United States is strategically overextended. Ukraine, Iran, Taiwan in the background. The Shadow Fleet campaign in the Atlantic. The U.S. Navy is not infinite. Its munitions stockpiles are not infinite. Its political will is not infinite. China, meanwhile, is watching with great interest, buying Iranian and Russian oil at discounted prices, strengthening its economic position, and waiting, simply waiting. And Europe, poor, fractured, strategically dependent Europe, is scrambling to convene virtual meetings with 35 nations about reopening the strait, while simultaneously refusing to send warships, while Trump threatens to cut off weapons to Ukraine if they don't join his Hormuz coalition, while Zelensky tours the Gulf states looking for security guarantees. The continent that invented the modern concept of geopolitics has never, in my lifetime, looked so utterly lost. Here is what I believe, and I say this not as a prediction, but as an analytical judgment rooted in everything I know about how power, economics, and imperial overreach interact. The United States will not achieve a clean military victory in the Strait of Hormuz. The geometry of the place favors the defender. Iran does not need a conventional navy. It destroyed that fantasy weeks ago. What it has is mines, drones, anti-ship cruise missiles, and the willingness to absorb punishment in exchange for making the strait economically unusable. Russia's presence, symbolic now, but capable of becoming operational, raises the stakes for any escalation. China's economic interests ensure that the pressure on Washington to find an exit will grow, not diminish. And so we will almost certainly arrive, as we always do after these catastrophic adventures, at a negotiated settlement at a table with diplomats, exchanging words instead of missiles, exactly as Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has been proposing for months. The question is, how many people have to die? How many billions have to be spent? How many harvests have to fail before Washington rediscovers the forgotten art of diplomacy? The USS Gerald R. Ford is in Crete. The laundry is on fire, but the real fire, the one that matters, is burning in the Strait of Hormuz. And Russia just handed it more fuel.